kind of reference the whole thing, like in a weird summary kind of way. Maybe if you can follow along, otherwise just be like, just move along yourself. Because it just came to me before when you were coming over. In fact, I had to take notes because that's perfect.
Okay, good. No, that's sweet.
Yeah, like, and sometimes I wonder when this stuff comes to me. It sounds awesome when it comes to me, and then when I actually start speaking of it, like, yeah, you missed it a little bit. Yeah, but you'll be able to clarify because I didn't completely get it down, and I know. Yeah, there's a lot to it. So, the first question. You ready, Rich? Do we need to get a new producer?
So we're on. It's on caster now. It's just waiting to get over to. Usually takes. There's like this lag.
How much did this room cost you, dude?
I don't know.
20 grand?
No, not
15?
15 probably
Okay.
somewhere. I mean, if you add up everything, I'm sure it's like, I don't know. I mean,
Some of it was
If
from
you
your
were to-
trading days.
yeah.
How many loss in trading did it cost you? He went all in on a day trading.
Nice.
Oh, there we go.
I love day
Let me
trading.
see.
And now it's
So
fun.
let's do this quiet on the set. Let's do I like to do
Are we rolling?
Okay, we're rolling. Cody. All right,
Gary.
I'm here with Cody. We're gonna run through his new book. You ready?
I'm ready.
Okay. I think mostly what the thing is, I'm before jumping into the whole book thing, I want to ask you, and this has to do with the book itself. So this whole book, kind of like, what are we doing here? What are we doing? Why are we even here doing this?
Just, you mean this conversation?
Yeah, like why do we sit here and do this and talk about this stuff?
Well, it's because we have to play that dirty game of making content.
Well, okay, so I'm thinking like this is what came to me just before I came over here. I was like, what Eckhart would describe as like what we're doing is we're using words to point to an experience that somebody could have.
Sure.
But then I had this thought, like, and I got this from watching you do this and reading your book, and that is actually tapping into this collective consciousness that exists as we speak and bringing that to the surface. So it's almost like, and I saw how that you were able to, it was like my whole curiosity was when I read the book and I was like, Cody wrote this? Honestly, I was like, Cody wrote this? And because I'd kind of known you before, and it was like, where did you get this information? Does it seem like you got the information literally from what you're talking about in the book of the collective consciousness, like almost like pulling it out? Because it seems like you pulled stuff from all these places and then you brought it to this point, and it was almost. I guess I'm asking you: are you surprised at some of the stuff you found?
Oh yeah, yeah, and the whole. So you're reminding me of this thing. I can't remember if it was Edward Edinger or Carl Jung. I think it was Edinger. He talks about how, like, we can experience the unconscious, right? Like that's where we can sort of grasp it the best, and like what Eckhart Tolle, right, is saying is like that we, that words are meant to point at this thing, right, that we're all sort of looking for. And the book, though, it was, so, we've been talking about dreams, like, and there's Jung taught this method of active imagination, which is like, if you have a problem, then, try to imagine an image that's associated with it. Right. And then just sort of break down the image and like look at it from like a symbolical point of view. and watch how it changes the problem, right? So what's happening then is we kind of, symbols are the basis of like consciousness. And so, but the symbols are dynamic, right? And so as the symbols change, our mind changes and our perspective and everything else. So this book ended up being a process of active imagination. So, and it's kind of weird, dude, because like in 2019, well, actually in 2009, I was strung out. It was really dark.
Remember.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Me and you were hanging out right after. Yep. And so I wrote this poem just because I was like I'd been awake for a few days, whatever. And the poem, what emerged was this like female psychopomp. And it just came to me that her name was Thalia, and I had no idea. I'd never heard of Thalia before, right? But this image stuck with me. And then in 2019, I was sober, and I had started reading Joseph Campbell and stuff, and I wrote another, like, just this poem just kind of continued, right? And this time it was basically the myth of Sophia, which is that the female, the divinity, the female aspect of divinity gets cast into matter, like on Earth, and then and it's just this weird Gnostic kind of myth. And it just kind of came. I think it came in response to me, like, trying to wrestle with this idea of like the God image and like the male God and like, where's the woman, right? Oh, he kicked her out of heaven because he was jealous because she was out, creating the universe and he didn't like it. So it was just like this fun poem or whatever. But then as I started writing this book, what emerged was the archetype of the alcoholic. And the archetype of the alcoholic is a variation of the trickster, which is also in alchemy is a variation of what Jung, it's called Mercurius, right? So and if you understand the archetype of the alcoholic, then you understand Mercurius. But the thing that's interesting to me is that Jung says that the female, the anima is the female psychopomp whose job it is to lead one towards Mercurius, right? And so, in other words, I'm having these dreams and I write this book, and then this whole sequence of events that's actually an alchemical sequence that Jung writes about is what I had just gone through. Right. And so I'm like learning this stuff in reverse. I'm like, holy fucking shit. Yeah. Like, and that's, I think, what makes the book, if it is compelling, that's what makes it compelling, is because it literally is, it just came out of the ether.
Well, yeah, that's because as I finished it, I thought, and I'm like, oh, okay, I kind of understand the whole concept of the book. I mean, we'll get into that in a minute, but as I finished the book, I was like, oh, I get it. And then I'm thinking about you as the author, which normally I don't think about the author. I'm like, I don't really know the author, so I just read the book. And I'm like, it came to me like, this sounds like you putting into words literally the experience you were having, like like you said, in reverse. Mm-hmm. And it matched. You didn't have to make it match.
Yeah.
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 And that's pretty cool.
It is. And
yeah.
It's funny too, because when I started writing, I just felt compelled to write. Like I remember I just opened my laptop, sat down and started writing. Yeah. And my editor hated it. I mean, it was this big process, and she's like, well, what's the point? Like, what are you trying to say? I was like, I don't know. I don't know, but something.
That's cool. Just check it out. Help me find it. Yeah, no, I get it.
Yeah. And she didn't come around until like almost the very end. She's like, oh my God. I remember she said, I think you're going to pull it off. And I was like,
that is so, I love it. I think that's just why when I read it and thought, oh, I need to ask Cody questions, and you're like, well, let's do it on this podcast, let's record or do whatever. I was thinking to myself, I was like, I think the story behind the story is probably as fascinating as the story itself. Although the whole story itself has gained some pretty good notoriety. Like, meaning you got some serious people that are like on board. That's
it's amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, the Jungian community is really stoked on it, dude. Murray Stein wrote me a blurb. He's like the grand poobah, Yeah. And once I got his blurb, like, then I had, the balls to like send it to some people in AA who have a little bit of clout. And they wrote me blurbs, and, Ian McCabe and David Shane. So it is like, it's a big deal. I mean, and again, it's like, I feel really blessed. I mean, Stephen Herman helped me a bunch. He's a Jungian doctor. He lives in the Bay Area, but he gave me the story of Jaime. So I was able to kind of piece it together. But, honestly, I feel really lucky that nobody had figured out this story. You know, I don't know why, but whatever.
Well, and to me, Rich heard me say this before. Like when in AA where it says more will be revealed, I'm like, who's revealing it and when?
Yeah, right.
And I feel like you just interviewed Bill
Shaberg. Yeah.
On the writing of the Big Book.
Yep.
And I was like, to me, that book was like, here's the more being revealed that I was interested in. I know everybody's not interested in that. They don't care. They don't care the whys, but I do.
Yeah.
I'm like, I'm not just gonna say, yeah, okay, here, do this. Okay, no, I gotta be like, why?
Yeah.
Explain me why, and maybe I'll do it. And even then, there's a chance I won't. But it's like I feel like this is in that same line, and it's kind of like dropping dogma and just embracing what is and seeing what's actually there it's almost like a shadow work of the Alcoholics Anonymous program. Literally what you described, like hey, let's look at some of the stuff that maybe doesn't match. It's the little shadow work that Jung talks about on a bigger picture with a collective group like they do in AA, which I see that's kind of what you're doing. I know just from the brief snippet of the conversation over here, you made a couple comments and I'm like, yep.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, Shaberg does the real dirty work with the AA shadow and with Bill's shadow, maybe. Yep. I feel like I give a proper answer because I think people still wrestle with like, why did Shaberg need to expose all this, right? Yep. And it's like, I feel like I actually I answer that question, that basically saying it doesn't matter because Bill Wilson was making a myth. Yep. There's a word for that, mythopoetics, and hopefully we're all making our own myths too. We just happen to kind of glom onto Bill's myth, right? The 12 steps, which are an effective, way of living for millions of people, but there's still like, I tried to get at some of that with Shaberg, but he's a historian. Yeah. So they just see the world differently.
No, it was interesting because hearing your interview with him, because I saw, and then when I finished this book, and I thought, this is another thing. Like, I love reading something when I'm like, okay, like I saw where you, and actually this is coming to me right now. What I just asked you about how you wrote this book, I saw how you found that same thing in how Bill wrote that book. Mm-hmm. Not being critical, not being judgmental of like it, but just that like, hey, this, like Bill's like, I just started writing. Mm-hmm. I mean, and that's essentially what he did, and that's kind of what you did. Yeah. Out of those things that I don't know how, if it's in here in the Jungian stuff, what you described that you're bringing out what's the word?
Well,
numinosa.
The numinosity or the
numinosa, and you bring that out. And when you bring something out, now correct me if I'm wrong. When you bring something out of the numinosa, there is that's essentially the self. The ego isn't a part of that.
Right. The ego is doing its best, I think, to define this thing that's happening, right. and is sort of like terrified by the whole process, right? And
that's the Jungian ego, not necessarily
right. Isn't that an interesting? Because I get into arguments with my friends in AA or NA or whatever about what's the ego, right? They're like, no, and it's almost like we define the ego as the shadow, which I think really limits our understanding because the ego is actually the opposite of the shadow. It's everything we can see, right? The shadow's the shit we can't see. So I think it's a really important distinction, that the ego versus the shadow. I try to make that a point, like when I do seminars and shit, just to try to help people. Because when I figured out what Jung was saying by ego, it really opened up a lot for me.
It did for me too. And when I say that, it's recent, like just literally, because I thought, my definition of ego goes more with Eckhart Tolle, which would be, attachment to thought and form.
Right, which I think fits, right?
It does fit.
Because it's that the addiction to the rationale, right? That's kind of what he's referring to. So we can be addicted to the ego just because we're unable to see that there's another like psychic complex that's actually driving the ego.
The self, right?
Yes, exactly.
That's what got me in the self, and it helped me understand it by putting higher self.
Sure.
Because then it's like there's this higher self that actually, and I've always felt like this higher self leads me through suffering, which I'm like, why is this always happening through suffering? Because on the other side is this awakening of like, oh, there it is, you know, this bliss, the whatever, the pink cloud, whatever you want to call it. There's a bliss on the other side of that. And when I saw that and read that, and I saw it in here, like Carl Jung's hard to understand. And the thing I got to say is that what you covered in here and being in AA, knowing AA, all of a sudden the Carl Jung stuff was like, because I've read a lot of Carl Jung and I'm like, what the hell is he talking about?
Yeah, he's like that.
And I think you simplified it so that, like, especially if somebody has experience in AA, then they can be like, oh yeah, I get that. Oh, now I kind of understand Carl Jung.
Yeah, and that's good.
Yeah, no, I think it's great.
Jung's, you know, he really is the maestro, man.
Yeah.
Because he takes into account, like I'm like you, like I know, like I love Eckhart Tolle, you know, I hung my hat on his shit for years and I still do, right? Like his meditations, his way of seeing the world. And there's been many of those sort of teachers along the way. But what I found like in the Jungian community is a lot of people, once they discover Jung, they don't really look elsewhere for meaning. And I think the reason is, for me at least, after writing this book and now doing this dream work and stuff, is just that there's just so much to uncover in one's own experience, in one's own psyche, and once you start to look at it from this really kind of analytical perspective, which is like a Jungian perspective, it just seems like there's no end to it. You know, it's very meaningful, dude.
Well, and I think it's interesting too, because a lot of times, like what you just described, you can get caught up on, or I get caught up in this intellectual game of playing with all these different things. But like what you described is you go into this intellectual game with Jung, and what comes out of it is this book. That's bigger than a game. And if this helps other people to make changes, now you're talking about this intellectual game that's being played with the self is actually creating results, which is what happened with Bill and the 12 steps.
Yeah.
Like that's the litmus test to, is this game that I play intellectually bringing anything to fruition for me or for anybody else?
Right.
Even if it's just for me and I know it, I'm okay with that.
Yeah.
But man, if other people can experience that, then it's like, oh wow, I'm onto something. And then it's like, well, who's onto something? You know, that's always kind of the who is onto something.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. I mean, because that's the thing. The self, the self is unconscious, right? So we can't really say for sure it's unconscious, so we can't know it. It's transcendent.
Right.
But it seems like there's evidence to support the idea that the self wants to express itself through the human experience and through the human ego. So then the thing is, it's like we need to find whatever that is that wants to be expressed through us, and that's the whole. It's the whole point of it, right? Like that's the meaningful life. Like I love that Joseph Campbell, he asked the question, what is the meaning of a flower? And like, I think that's a really good question, right? But the flower fulfills its potential no matter what, unless something comes along and eats it or whatever, right? So, but how many humans just don't fulfill their potential, right? They don't understand that the flower, it's just like, you know, is meaning like in the stock market, or for me, is it in construction, or like, you know what I mean? Like we all, and I find this a lot in the program. It's just like, we're so goddamn proud of ourselves because we have this big company and we drive this nice car, you know, and the wife's got fake titties and the whole thing, right? But how meaningful is that shit, right? So there is something to be said about figuring out what it is that wants to express itself through us, and then pursuing that avenue, right?
Well, and I think what came up as, and I think I was listening to it this morning, and I don't know, what was I listening to? Yeah, I was listening to something somebody sent me on emotional sobriety, which was a letter Bill wrote.
Yeah.
So talking about Viktor Frankl and being in Auschwitz, and like that. The way to get through that was finding the meaning, and I think if I get this right, because I just listened to it, was, you know, it's like, not what does life how did he put it, the meaning of life isn't what I can get from life, but what life I can see. And I'm misquoting it, but essentially it's like, this is what's happening, this is what is, accept it for what it is. And that's where your purpose lies, exactly in this acceptance of what is. And it would be similar to through suffering, because we usually accepting what is suffering, because we don't have to accept what is if we're on a yacht, like with the girls with the titties. I'm good with that. There's no level of acceptance I have to do on that experience. It's the level of acceptance of suffering. And if you lean into that suffering, which is exactly what Eckhart says, then what's right on the other side of that is this tapping into that, like you described, the
Numinosa.
That's a tough word. I'm going to eventually get it. Numinosa. And what arises out of that then is this higher self, and affects yourself in the moment, and then can affect the others around you, which was his experience in, man's search for meaning.
Yeah. Right. Yep. Yeah. And those guys too, a lot of times those people that tend to find their higher self or tap into the numinosum or whatever. So Jung uses the word vocation, which is, so it's a Pauline idea, right? Like
is that the same as the way Bill used it in the book?
I don't think so. Maybe. I can't remember when Bill used it, but I know in the 12 steps we get confused because we often equate it with like employment, right? So, but it's not that, but it's like a spiritual vocation, right? So,
yeah, okay.
And that becomes, so, Jung says that compulsion is the great mystery of human life. And so on one hand, we have these compulsions that sort of manifest through the shadow or through suffering or whatever, like we're driven, right? But the people but there's another aspect, I guess, of compulsion, which is called vocation, which kind of accounts for why a dude that just did 10 years for stealing cars and stuff is now going to a meeting every day of the week with newcomers in his car and just can't get enough recovery, right? He's literally being compelled into it, like almost with like monkish discipline. So I think that's another part of this self and like this self-expression thing is once the self gets you, then it doesn't require discipline to do this stuff.
Yeah, right. That's awesome.
Yeah. And it's amazing, right?
Yeah.
That's the power.
Yeah, because discipline isn't going to work. I can't discipline myself to do anything.
Me neither.
So I kind of think that is almost like a flow. Once I tap into the flow, let go of whatever I think I need, I find myself being able to do the things I need to do without really having to do it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
awesome. See, there's so much good stuff in here that, and I got to tell you though, I've read a lot of stuff, and it's like I don't hear things, and this is why it was fascinating for me, is because I at the end of this book, honestly, Cody, I was reading it and I was like, that's so weird that you know the person that wrote this. Like, it really was. It's bizarre. It's like I tried to, at one point here in Huntington, Eckhart came to speak, and somebody I knew owned the speaking facility, whatever. I was like, hey, I can get a chance to see him. Like, oh yeah, it'd be so great to see Eckhart. And it's like in the back of my mind, I knew he's not going to see anybody because he doesn't see himself as somebody that needs to be seen. It's useless. So it's not going to work anyway. But I was like, maybe there's a chance, he shakes hands or whatever, I knew it wouldn't happen. And sure enough, the guy's like, yeah, he doesn't really see anybody. And I know why, because the whole idea of seeing him is literally the opposite of what he talks about.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. Even though I'm willing to still go that route if I need to. And it's like, oh, well, here I know Cody wrote this book and I was reading the words and I actually was, I got to say I'm impressed and a lot of respect just for the words alone. Like,
just for the words.
Well, meaning like you the way that you use the words, because I read a lot, and it's like it was simple enough to understand, but on a complex subject that could be understood, and I was just fascinated by the writing itself. And I was even like, did his editor do this?
Well, I appreciate that. And if that's the thing, right? Like, I had a really good editor.
Yeah, you said that a lot. That's what made me think, because you said that a lot. But.
Yeah. And to be honest, like, yeah. But most good writers do have good editors.
Right.
But what she did mostly was we just cut. Like, I have like 500,000 words, 65,000 made it into the book. You know what I mean? So there's just so much cutting, and then the final drafts are just cutting more and more and more. Because my goal was to write a book that has a lot of depth to it, but that a person can just read. Because I'm the type of reader, dude, I'm lazy. So I'm always looking ahead, like, how long is this chapter, And so I wanted to make them, like, short and sweet. So there's a lot more that could be said on every chapter. But, what made it in, I feel like, was important enough to...
That's the next book.
Yeah.
Now you got it flowing.
Yeah, there's certainly going to be more books.
Yeah, no, I think that there's all kinds of depth and stuff. And, okay, so... going through her, I know that I have notes. I have 2 books, and I have a lot of notes in.
Is that your other book?
That's my other book.
Should I hand it to you?
Yeah.
All right.
Because let me see. I know that you've already covered. I know that you covered a lot of this stuff, but in a lot of different ways. You've covered this in different things that you shared about. But the things.
We good?
Okay. So the numinosis is. I think it's just a new term for something that
The numinosum.
the numinosum.
Yeah.
That and describe that really quick.
Okay, I love this question because I had a revelation this morning about how to describe it.
Yeah.
So there's 2 ways. So C.S. Lewis. So I'll tell you the other way first. So the other morning I go into my garage. I'm gonna work out. I have a gym in my garage, and like I just get out there and I move one thing, and then all of the sudden like a white kind of it looked like a ball. It like scurried across the room, and I was like, God damn, that was big. What is that? Right? And it went behind a barbell plate.
Alive?
Well, I was like, fuck, is that like a, what was that? And I'm doing this DreamWorks. I'm like, God, am I hallucinating? You know what I mean? Like I'm just tripping out. That's numinosity. When I finally moved the plate, I built up the courage. It was just a little plastic ball, right? But my psyche had sort of endowed this inanimate object with meaning, with fear, with whatever. That's numinosity. So if you go into, if you go into a haunted house and they tell you, a woman was murdered behind this door, and like that's the most haunted room in the whole house. Like be careful, we're gonna feel something before we go in there. That's numinosity. So the numinosity then is sort of this energy, this transformative energy that we impose upon religious symbols.
Wow, that's good. That's a good definition. I like the ball. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's complex too. I have to think about that in a minute. But I get it. Like I get that fear that it brings. And speaking of that, because it made me think of this. Like a lot of times, if I don't know something, I bring more of that.
Sure.
And then as I know more about something, the fear disappears. I could say flying, for example, absolutely terrified until I start to understand it, and then it's like there's no fear in it anymore. But or critters, like as you get to whatever, and I know the amount of fear and how the feeling arises and how that changes everything in the way I act. Anyway, that get excited. Okay, so then the other thing though that still gets me a little bit is just the term archetype.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I know you've used it in here a lot, and I've heard it so many times. It's like the simple definition would be what?
Well, I think the simple definition is an archetype is a symbol or like an image, like, in this case, like a religious image or a spiritual image or a mythological image, whatever, that is common to like large groups of people, right? Or more accurately, common to everybody. So it's a symbol, like Bill Wilson says, deep down in every man, woman, and child is the fundamental idea of God. That is the archetype of God, right? And he's right.
Where did you get that from? Because it seems when I hear just the word archetype, for some reason I'm thinking medieval.
Sure. Well, it's a Jungian.
Is it Jungian?
Yeah, I think his great contribution, I think the thing he's most known for is his postulate on the archetypes of the collective unconscious.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I was wondering where I got it from.
A lot of people have built on that. And it's funny, like in the book Symbols of Transformation, I'll just give you one example of how he started to figure this shit out, was that he had he was like the director of this psychiatric hospital in Switzerland, and there was a patient in there who had a dream or something, like he had this like vision of this, like that the sun there was a giant tube hanging off the sun, and it was swinging back and forth, and that's what was making the wind. And Jung was like, oh, that's weird. It's just a hallucination from a psychotic person. But Jung later read in like some just really like very obscure book about, I think it's a tribe in Africa, where their myth is that the sun has a giant penis, and that when the penis sways back and forth, it creates the wind.
Nice.
And so Jung was like, these two things are so it's not just random, right? Like there's a clear connection there in something deeper in the psyche that's making these images sort of appear this way. And so he started to study the myths of many different cultures and sort of piecing together what is archetypal and what isn't, right? And so like Joseph Campbell came along and he kind of built on this with his hero's journey, right? And he talks a lot about the myths, how like there's, you know, the myths essentially all kind of have the same stories, right? Like a virgin birth or like, you know, a flood or, you know, a dying God eating the God, right? Like Jesus's, you know, thing about the sacrament. So all the myths they're sort of archetypal in that way.
Okay, that makes sense. I get it. I get that. There's something that just came up here because I know it's at the end, but you just touched on it, and because you're there, let me see if I can remember what it was. Because you just described. Oh yeah, I know what it is. I got to find it here where you talked about it. It's basically it. Just describe to me a little bit, because you just touched on this. I don't know where I can find it, but I know you have all this stuff in your head because you've talked about it enough. But you just described the archetype, whether it be, I know what it is. There's some type of destruction that has to happen. Do you know what I'm talking about? There's some type of destruction in every archetype. There's a destruction of the ego, essentially, right?
Yeah, I mean, it seems to be a fundamental. Like it is, it's key to change and to you know to experience a psychic change. There is, you know, this destruction or death of the ego, but I think to say the death of the ego is actually misleading, right? Because the ego doesn't actually die. What the ego is the thing that's transformed. So Jung called it an individuated ego. So the process of ego individuation is where the ego, it learns to re-relate itself to the self. But that you know, Bill Wilson called it that alcohol, he says, it basically ran him into an impossible dilemma, right? And he says the ego is deflated at depth. So that ego deflation is the same thing that Jung describes ego deflation as well. And that is symbolized in the myths as death, typically, spiritual death.
I think I found where I put notes in that it talks about, when you're talking about the mystery of compulsion, which every alcoholic knows, that everybody knows compulsion, whatever. And the atonement depicts how, I'm reading from here, it depicts disrupts the ego's intention. This is so different from. This is what's so different. This is why I like this. I gotta say, I like it. It's so different because it feels more like an experience that I've had. If I was gonna put it in words, and I kind of gave up putting my experience into words, it got too bizarro. But it was almost like something was pushing me through. And who was it pushing through? The self disrupts the ego's intentions, frustrating its need for security and comfort in order to wake the ego up from the delusion of control.
Yeah.
That's like literally what you said about this mystery of compulsion.
Yeah.
And then talking about compulsion is the great mystery of human life, and it's thwarting our conscious will, as if we have a will. And there's a weird part about this that that I've noticed in experience, if I pay close enough attention, there's not really a will.
Yeah. No, it takes a lot of insight to arrive at that.
Yeah.
I do believe that.
Yeah.
But the Jungians they're keen on this, dude.
Yeah, I get it. And that clicked for me today.
Yeah.
Because
good.
I've been thinking about this and I hadn't read it or heard it anywhere, and I'm like, well, you can't have something click for you that you haven't read or heard about.
Sure.
Because then there's no confirmation.
Yeah, we need confirmation.
Yeah,
right?
And it's like, and literally, this has been like the last month where I just have. It's like this body goes and does this.
Yep.
This body goes and does this, and then it does this, and I'll tell you why. It has to do with smoking cigars. It's like that's a compulsion, and
Sure.
it's like I have found that no matter how much I resist, no plan, whatever I do, I'm gonna keep smoking these cigars. Okay, well, I can have a story, whatever, but it's like, this is what it's doing. This is what's happening, and it's related to a compulsion. But okay, so this other thing you talk about that I highlighted here said talking about Edinger, and I don't know Edinger, but it wrote the self as the supreme psychic authority that subordinates the ego to it, confirming that the self is identical with the God image. I love this.
Yeah.
Just because it's like it just feels like what's happened to me over time, over different times, and sometimes this is the part where in Alcoholics Anonymous I get frustrated because something's happening to us in Alcoholics Anonymous. And I know because I've left it and come back, and it's like I've and tried so many things, and it's not out there. So something's happening in Alcoholics Anonymous. The words being used to describe it are just like, to me, it's like, really? That's it? You know, is this all I get? You know, and I'm like, I would love, I don't need to change the experience because I'm here, I'm sober. I can just lean on that if that's it. But I know I'm not going to do that. I would like to have words that have a lot more to it that's described like, hey, this kind of, how about this? And not that they have to agree with, but that at least have some type of validity in my experience. And I feel like that this is the stuff you're talking about. And the cool thing about it is I feel like that it's been here all along. By the way you brought it in from Jaime to Young, and then through the whole picture where it's like, okay, so if you look back at this whole picture, you have to say, there's something to it. I don't know what it is, but yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, it's weird, bro. I mean, even with me writing this book, like I wrote, cause you know, the editor says, hey, you need to get permission from all the people you cite if they're big, especially if they're big citations. So I had to write, you know, Princeton Press and just all these different publishers, and Alcoholics Anonymous responded and said, you can't quote us. You can't quote the book. And I just, it's like, and honestly, bro, I had to dig around because some people who I sort of look up to in AA, these old timers were like, oh, I guess you can't quote it then. One guy said, well, yeah, so that means you just have to rewrite all of that stuff in your own language. And I was like, well, that is like worse. That's worse than just quoting it. Like, you want me to like steal the ideas from Bill Wilson, essentially? And there's just a lot of like weird dogma, you know. The response that I got from that guy was, well, you just consider yourself, you know, you got clean and sober or whatever, so now you just the selfish alcoholic or drug addict who thinks he could just quote the book, you like as if you own it or something, you know. And I was like, dumb, you know. So I think what I'm saying is there's this sort of culture of like don't look too deeply at anything, you know, which is really similar in almost every single religion, right? Like the Mormon church is the same way. Like, don't look too deeply because you're going to find a bunch of shit that doesn't really agree with the dogma.
Right.
But, you know, Bill Wilson hated the dogma. He was all about breaking it down. He was very unorthodox. That's what he called his using LSD, right? As a part of a spiritual awakening. This unorthodox method, right? So I think we need to be unorthodox, you know? Like, I love Alcoholics Anonymous. I love the 12-step fellowships. I'm engaged, you know, like I do like attend meetings, but like personally for me right now, I'm having a hard time relating to the program, like to the people in the program, because there's not a lot of depth. It does feel like it's weird. There's all this like amazing wisdom, but people are so afraid of like going out of bounds, just even a little bit, that whatever. I mean, I think it's frustrating. Yeah,
and I don't need the one thing that I think the most important thing to clarify, especially talking about this, is that when you bring this whole thing full circle, what you've done, you described that Bill Wilson is bringing this 12 steps, which was a solution for so many people, follows, whether he knew it or not, follows this Jungian path, whether he knew it or not, which. That's what I would call the collective unconscious. When you can pull something out, I always called it just spiritual. When something happens over here that isn't correlated over here, they don't fit. Call it what you even use this term, quantum entanglement, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
You know, there's something happening that we can't understand. And before that, you pulled Bill's story in and put it in this. That goes here. Hey, look, this makes more sense of how he got it. Good. A lot of people don't need that. Like, where'd he get it? And the reason, the important thing is, what I've noticed was I was caught up in that dogma at one point, where be careful with the lines, what you say, where you go, what you're talking about. And I was like, what I found was that's fine, except this isn't true to me. I'm now saying things that aren't true to fit. And that became really hard on my personal psyche, the personal self that was not congruent with the way it was. And I actually left AA just going, you know, I think Bill's full of shit, and I think I'm more like Bill, and I know I'm full of shit. And when Bill wrote the book, this was like a year after, and I read the writing of the big book, I was like, this is exactly what I thought was going on. Not necessarily with AA, but I surely found it in me. Like, all of a sudden now you've created a character inside of the program that does and says things that, you're not quite that good. You're probably a little worse. You know, and it was like kind of that shadow work, like quit pretending, you know, but also not being like, oh yeah, I'm still this fucked up dude. You know, like,
it kind of goes both ways.
Laughing about it. I haven't quite made it. I still be my wife. Progress rather than perfection. Whatever, you know, whatever the scenario was. And so, like, and this is the thing I got to say about this is that, and having listened to you and read, I haven't read all of Bill S. Shaber's book, but I've been listening to it, and you know, I'm 20 hours in, so I still have another 20 hours to listen. But
it's a big book.
It's a long book, yeah. But the thing that I have to say that was the best part about this is, that's fine and dandy. I know people in the AA are okay with that book, and it says a lot, and that some people don't care. But the great thing in your interview, and I know you didn't get to it, is how you brought this stuff, the same stuff, full circle back around and kind of dropped it back on Bill W. Like, look, this is why he did what he did. Yeah, like as a whole myth. Does that ring true? And
absolutely. Yeah, but he, you know, that's the thing is he's a historian. So I actually have a friend who's a PhD. He's a librarian. But so he's very familiar with all these different branches of like academia, right? And I mean, he told me straight up, like, the historians they're like the hated like people in academia because they want the facts. Like, the only thing they can deal with are the facts. But it's like the facts don't really, they're not even that important. Like, I love what Jung says, you know, he said it on the first page of his biography in 1961, I'm now undertaking to tell my personal story, to tell my personal myth. And it doesn't matter if the stories that I tell are true or not. That's not even the point, right? And that's the point with Bill's myth, right? And I don't know that, and it does make sense because I feel like what my book does is provides an adequate answer to Bill Shaber's book. You know what I mean? Like, if you want to look at it from like a philosophical perspective, like, why was it okay for Bill to do this? Because he was creating his own myth. And so the question then for us is, how do we create ours, you know?
Yeah, and then that kind of makes me think, like, okay, so as I'm telling my story, whatever the story is, and as long as I don't feel like well, see, this is the problem that I run into with myself is, I could find where I would be what I would call manipulating, which would be saying something that may or may not be true, but kind of like what Bill does. But the point of it is to help this sponsee or help this person. I've changed it around, but the only problem with that is, and I think Bill ran into this which is why I don't know if he ran into it or not. Well, when you do that, there might be a depression later on. You might not quite feel like you're being true. You might not. There might be a self. You know, the idea of like when you try to make it congruent with the self pushes you through this thing. Trying to stay Jungian here. Pushes you through this experience. Then the ego tries to define it later on, and it can't because it's kind of incongruent rather than staying in that. I don't know if that makes sense, but it's like, are you really that? And
sure.
And yeah, I guess. I can see this is where I have to be careful because if I'm not careful, I go all over the place. So
no, you're good. I mean, I think it's interesting that Bill suffered from depression, and there's clinical depression, and he may have had some chemical issues like in his own brain that caused that. You know what I mean? But he just might have not been the spiritual giant that we all think he was. I mean, at least he sought outside help, right? Because the problem we have in AA is like, oh, you know, someone's bipolar and they don't go see the fucking doctor because that would mean somehow that they're not working the program well enough. And it's just, and all of these like little dogmas and little ideas that we have, I just think are far more damaging than they're doing any good. Because I could tell you, like, for me, doing individual therapy was as impactful as working the 12 steps. I did the steps first, which was great. But that taught me how to bring an open mind to therapy. Right. And then my whole world opened up and I unlocked all of these sort of insights and this intimacy and stuff like that, like that I just could never have gotten working with a sponsor, like some selfish alcoholic. Like they just, you know, they would just tell me to shut up, you know, like stop complaining and like go make amends or something. And it's just,
and that was a group you were with. You got yourself in that group.
Yeah. Well,
There's other
oh
groups
yeah.
there. Yeah.
No, right. No, but that is, I mean, there, but you know, it's true.
I don't, and you know what? That's irrelevant. But okay.
And now here I am, you know,
Yeah.
in this other group.
Yeah. Now there's no group. How are we doing on time? We got 10 minutes.
Cool.
Okay, so see, now this is where it's like, there's no point in getting too far. I mean, there's other stuff that like I could start totally get off on the mycelia again of this consciousness, because the mycelia of consciousness.
Yeah.
Understanding, like I know Rich talked a little bit last week about mycelia. It's like the more you learn about mycelia, the more it just gets really bizarre.
Yeah.
Like actually mycelia being the aliens that would rule the universe.
Oh yeah, I like that.
Yeah, like they're everywhere. The spores are everywhere, and that they're under everything, and that they're actually. I even saw recently that there's a mushroom that grows on top of an ant, and then it goes tentacles into the ant brain, and it controls the ant's brain.
Wow. That's
now,
pretty cool.
AI could be making shit. They're telling me shit, and I'm just like,
oh, AI told you?
No,
that?
I don't know. This is where I don't know what's really going
Yeah.
on, because you can't tell. Like, this is something I saw on Instagram, and it was like, yeah, is that really happening? Because anymore, people, you just mix shit in, and pretty soon it's like, whatever. But
so you want to hear something real trippy about that? Like, so going back to that alchemical notion, and I see this with AI too, and also people with conspiracy theories. We tend to, so just like the alchemists did with like the chemicals, they would project the unconscious into the chemicals, and then assume that like the chemicals were behaving like their unconscious was. So like if a person is like super just hip on like conspiracy theories, like I see this all the time. They talk about the conspiracy is essentially a symbol of the self, right? So I think it's interesting that the mycelia, you know what I mean? Oh, they're under everything. They're everywhere. Mm-hmm. They're controlling the universe.
Right, yeah.
That's what the self's doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So
Oh,
it's like it's a projection, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. Good. See, like, gosh.
Which, not to say that it's true or false, you know, like it may be true. Like it's probably true. Like I haven't studied mycelia that in that depth, but. But
way when you use it in the book in terms of mycelia of consciousness, it is something that's woven in between the collective, right? It's what holds the collective together.
Yeah. I mean, Jung said, I wanted to figure out what unconscious rhizome I sprang from, right? So he and then it turns out, I mean, that he hooks up with Jaime, and Jaime's eating mushrooms, and they go to Taos. So, but there is that connection. So did you notice the footnote where I talked about Terence McKenna?
I should have, because I love Terence McKenna.
Yeah, it's in that chapter. So the point, it's kind of a stretch, but it's like, because he says that mushrooms might have really created consciousness, right?
Yeah.
Because the primates were eating the mushrooms.
Yeah. I've seen the show.
Yeah, see, that's the archetype of the alcoholic. Right? Like that's sort of a projection of that, but it's like that getting fucked up or getting intoxicated is so powerful that it actually created the human ego. That's the archetype of the alcoholic.
Okay.
So it's like, like Ming pointed this out to me, like the point I'm making in my book is like that our myth stems from the archetype of the alcoholic, but so does Jung's myth, right? But then I went a step further, and I was like, well, maybe consciousness itself comes from this archetype,
Yeah.
That's called that's psychological incest, by the way.
Well, and the best part of all is this would just be another conversation, like with Rich or with somebody in some coffee shop or in some room, and I've had a million of them. If you wouldn't have been able to get this book published and get people that actually are influential in the Jungian society to participate with you. Like, it'd just be another thing. How many things like that are there out there that are just under the surface, not happening, and why not? Like the breakthrough to actually put this all together would be, to me, would be laziness, fear, all the the things, because how much of this kind of stuff just sits under the surface of all of us, waiting if we can just get out of the way for 1 second and just walk through that fear, just do it, take the time, spend the minute, and all of a sudden now we have this rising up of whatever purpose, which is kind of what you're talking about, whatever the purpose is for whatever, it's like you have that purpose.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I think we all have something to create,
Yeah. Your story matches the story in the book.
It does. Don't tell anyone.
That's so weird. No, I love that. Like when that's it. Like literally, you're living what you're talking about. There's no better way than to know that. Like, and it doesn't really matter who's involved. Like you're doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's super cool.
Thanks,
that's why
dude.
I was just like, and right away I was like, there was resistance. I know now when there's resistance, there's. It's one of those traits that are character defects. Resistance. It is. It's based in fear, and I know if I can just push through whatever resistance it is, and it's usually egoic and whatever, jealousy, fear, whatever it is, and so it's like around the other side, and I think I told you, like I read, hey guys, I'm going to write this book, and my first response would be like, fuck, you know how to write a book, you're dumb, and it's like instead what I said was, cool, I want to read it. Literally like the opposite thing. That opened the door for all of this stuff, and I'm so glad I did. Yeah. I'm so glad I didn't resist this stuff.
Yeah.
Be out of like some kind of weird. Like
I totally understand, bro.
Yeah.
Because I would.
I know you could. You were.
I would resist it.
You
know
were.
what I mean?
You were like. You knew. You're like. I know my friends are gonna think this is fucking stupid. And I knew exactly where you were coming from, and knowing that I was kind of still in it, and it was like I hadn't quite walk through it, but I was just I'm at this place where it's like, dude, I don't really know. Quit thinking I know stuff and just be open to other people's things and participate with them in their lives, whatever they're doing.
Sure.
And encourage them, whatever.
Yeah.
I think
and I've learned too, like if somebody's like, oh, I wrote a book, I'm like, that's fucking awesome. What's it about? If you ever tell an alcoholic that you're writing a book, they'll never ask you what it's about because they know it's not about them. They just assume it's about you because they're like, well, if I wrote a book, it would be about me, No,
you're right. Like it always has to be like, oh, if I write a book, it has to be an autobiography. Yeah. Anyway, Rich, you got to go.
Thanks, Rich.
You did great.
All right, good job. Hey, one last thing. Answer this one question for everybody. The artwork on the cover.
Oh, the artwork on the cover. So my buddy Abe McCowan did the artwork on the cover, and so I didn't choose this until the book was done, which is interesting because I didn't write the chapters about Jaime until the very end. I had the book written, and then I heard about Jaime, so I had to write those chapters and basically fit them in there. And after I had done that, I was like, oh, I should see if Abe has any cool art that I could use, and I saw this, and I was like, oh, that's it.
That's good. Yep. It turned out well.
Yeah, because it's kind of like, I guess it's like Mountain Lake shadow, or because Mountain Lake's people help the sun rise, and this guy might have something to do with the moon rising. It's also a symbol of the self, right? This sort of death creature that's coming out of the dark. If you notice too, it's walking towards you. So it's this. The self is sort of always beckoning. You know what I mean? It's like moving. It's making approaches or advances towards us, like whether we see it or not. Which is it's really subtle that it's taking a step forward. So there's a lot of different things in there. It's also, like it's a little bit appropriative, but it's drawn by a white guy, but the book was written by a white guy, and it's like I talk about appropriation a lot, but I'm also making the case that like we're not trying to appropriate people's myths. We're not trying to appropriate Western myth or Native American myth or anything like that. Like we're finding our own myth, right? So this is in that sense, like this also is a representation of my myth. So
yeah, totally.
All right.
Yeah.
Now to make sure
Subscribe, share, comment.
Thank you. That's cool.
Good job, Rich.
Thanks, bro.
Thanks, Rich.
Thank you. Thanks.
No, it's good stuff.
Really, that was really good, honestly.